وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كما يقول المثل، هناك اثنتان من الغوريلات الثقيلة في السياسة الأمريكية: الرئيس الحالي جو بايدن والرئيس الأسبق دونالد ترامب، وكل منهما مصمم على هزيمة غريمة في الانتخابات المقبلة في نوفمبر. ولكن قبل خوض تلك المعركة، على كل منهما الفوز بالترشيح الرسمي من حزبيهما السياسيين. وفي نظام الانتخاب الأمريكي يحدث ذلك من خلال الانتخابات التمهيدية. ستبدأ الانتخابات التمهيدية في ولاية أيوا في منتصف يناير، ثم تنتقل إلى إرجاء البلاد في الأشهر التي تليها. الانتخابات التمهيدية حساسة، وفيها تتوفر الفرصة لكل مرشح أن يسارع الغوريلا وأن يتفوق كزعيم شرعي لحزبه. هناك أمثلة عديدة سابقة لمرشحين أقل أهمية وحققوا نتائج مفاجئة وجيدة في الانتخابات التمهيدية، وأثروا بشكل كبير في مسار الانتخابات. فهل سيحدث هذا الثانية في العام 2024؟ كي نبحث في موضوع الانتخابات التمهيدية لحزبين الديمقراطي والجمهوري، يسرني أن أستضيف نخبة من المراقبين السياسيين: جاكوب رباشكين, Josh Kraushaar, and David Hawkins. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We have a uniquely American way of choosing candidates for high office. In the old days, parties would have conventions of activists get together to choose their standard bearer. In reality, this often meant the decision was made in a small room filled with cigar smoke. Now there's democracy everywhere, a lot of it. Elections to determine who will run in elections. Let's take a closer look at how we do it in America with David Hawkins, Jacob Rubashkin, and Josh Kraushaar. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me this morning. Let's start with the Republican Party. They have had one of the oddest pre-election seasons in history. The biggest news just came out recently that the Colorado Supreme Court says Trump can't even be on that state's primary ballot. Why did that happen, and what impact is this likely to have? David, you were around when that constitutional amendment was approved in 1868. So tell us what this is all about.
Wow, let me try and do it as quickly as possible. Right, so this was an amendment added to the Constitution after the Civil War that was designed to prevent people who'd been associated with the Confederate states that broke away from the United States during the Civil War, that those Confederate political officials from ever becoming part of the federal government again. And it says that no official, nobody who has ever participated in an insurrection against the United States or given aid and comfort to such an insurrection should ever hold an office in the federal government again.
So, Jacob, on the one hand, the Supreme Court is filled with Republican appointees, some very, very conservative, likely to support Trump. On the other hand, this is a states' rights issue. Colorado wants to run an election the way it wants to run an election. Shouldn't the Supreme Court defer to the will of the top judicial body in the state of Colorado?
Well, look, I think it's above my pay grade to predict what the Supreme Court is going to do, in certainly in this day and age. But I do think you're touching on a important contradiction here between the actions of a state Supreme Court and the potential for the United States Supreme Court to step in on an issue that they have been very, very reticent to touch over the last couple of years, namely former President Donald Trump. We've seen an intense level of discomfort that the court has with arguing and hearing arguments on anything relating to Trump, especially since he's left office and he's in this odd space as a former president, a private citizen, but also still the leader of his political party, the likely presidential nominee in the upcoming presidential election. And so the court is going to have their hand forced here by the Colorado State Supreme Court. I don't know what they're going to do, but I think that there are thorny political questions that are separate and apart from the thorny legal questions that the Colorado Supreme Court was attempting to answer.
So, Josh, let's expand the conversation a bit here. Republicans lost the last election for president, but the same guy who lost has such a tight stranglehold on the Republican voter base that he didn't even participate in a single pre-election political debate. How is that possible?
Well, look, number one, he has maintained a significant lead by virtue of the fact that he was he's a former president, and also the fact that these legal cases, the notion that Trump is offering that there's a deep state out to get him, and that you have all these multiple legal cases in different venues, and now you have a state Supreme Court trying to take him off the ballot. I mean, that has fueled Republican voters to his side, and I fully expect this ruling in a split decision, a 4-3 decision by a Supreme Court, by the way, that was in Colorado. All the judges have been appointed by Democratic governors, so this is sort of an intra-party divide, if you will, even within the Democratic Party on how to view this ruling. But that is rocket fuel for Trump's political fortunes, at least in the Republican primary, where he can now make the argument, as he has been, that there's a bunch of bureaucrats and Ivy League appointed judges that are out to get him, and that it's done outside the normal political avenues.
And David, can you just give us a little sense of perspective on this? Trump, if his aspirations are fulfilled, he will be the Republican standard bearer the third time in a row. That rarely happens in modern American history. I think you have to go back to the 50s before we had somebody who did it 3 times in a row, even earlier, perhaps.
That is going to be a question for historians and psychologists to ruminate about for years. Just the historical point I was going to make is Donald Trump is the first defeated president who has tried to make a comeback since the 1800s. Most defeated presidents go away to a quiet life of tending to their presidential library and writing their memoirs.
And Josh, when you look at Iowa, for whom is it make or break?
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, more than any of the other candidates, because he spent the most money in Iowa. He was originally the candidate that was going to really take Trump on one-on-one and compete nationally. And instead, he's had a lot of dysfunction within his own campaign operation. But the reality is that Iowa is a state that has a disproportionate share of social conservatives that make up the caucuses, activists. Bob Vander Plaats, who's one of the most important Christian conservative activists within the state, endorsed Ron DeSantis.
How do you define getting close to Trump?
You know, all the money, all the resources, all the political capital is really for naught. And it's going to be a more likely of a Haley-Trump clash into New Hampshire.
And let me ask Jacob and David, do either of you think that Ron DeSantis is going to get within that 10-point margin that Josh identified?
No.
A no from
well,
Jacob?
as my colleague said, I think that's above our pay grade as we're talking now.
And Jacob, when you look at Donald Trump, how far ahead is he?
Polling averages have him at or a little bit above 50% of the vote. DeSantis and Nikki Haley, the former South Carolina governor, who's the other main competitor in the race at this point, both in the mid to high teens. Perhaps DeSantis a few points ahead, touching 20%, but he's got about 30% to make up if he wants to beat Trump. The reality is, though, DeSantis's position is going in the wrong direction. You know, there were moments earlier in the year where DeSantis was threatening Trump's lead in Iowa, where it was perfectly reasonable to believe that he could actually win the state. And now we're talking about nothing has gone right for the Florida governor so far. There was a new poll out recently that showed Nikki Haley actually overtaking him. I think it's game over for DeSantis. He faces a very punishing post-Iowa run between New Hampshire, where he's in fourth place behind not just Nikki Haley, but also Chris Christie. And then South Carolina, of course, Nikki Haley's home state, where she'll put up a good performance. So look, he's got a lot of ground to make up. None of the endorsements that he's pulled so far have improved his standing in the polls. Whether he can have a bit of an upset on the margin because of his organizational capacity is an open question.
And Josh, just before we go to the break, let's assume for a minute that Ron DeSantis does not meet your single-digit threshold and he pulls out of the race. Where does his money and where does his support go? Does it go just blend into Donald Trump's, or does it go to another contender like Nikki Haley?
That's an important question, and I think the jury is still out. The polls suggest that it wouldn't go to just one candidate. That there are some Trump fans that also like DeSantis, and some of that support would go to Trump, and some of it is among Republicans who are conservatives that want someone who is an alternative to Trump. That for personal reasons, for legal problems that he's facing, for electability reasons, that they want anyone but Trump. So there's a mix. I do think in New Hampshire, DeSantis may be actually taking more votes away from Haley. It's a more moderate electorate in New Hampshire. So I think I've talked to the Haley campaign in recent days. They actually they would like DeSantis to drop out. They actually think it's in their interest for DeSantis to leave the race and have some of those votes go their way. But I think when you look at the data nationally, a lot of the DeSantis folks actually like Trump a whole lot. And I'm not sure it would play out entirely in Haley's favor when you look at that.
Actually, just before we break, David, Josh raised a very interesting point. Is there an insurance policy in the Republican primary field for, a Donald Trump-like candidate, just in case something happens to Donald Trump?
All the candidates in the field, except for I guess you'd say Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, have been playing this very delicate game of trying to distance themselves from Donald Trump and say, I should be the nominee instead of Donald Trump, without ever taking him on and castigating him and criticizing him.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to shift gears and look at what appears to be a non-election for Democrats, but let's go deeper at what the primary season may actually hold for Joe Biden and his party in just a moment. Again, my guests today include David Hawkins. David is senior editor of The American Leader, a nonprofit taking on America's biggest systemic problems. He was the founding editor of thefulcrum.com, and he spent 2 decades as a senior editor at CQ and Roll Call, 2 must-read news sites covering Capitol Hill. Also with us is Jacob Rabashkin. Jacob is a reporter and analyst with Inside Elections, an online platform where he provides analysis of political campaigns at every level of American government, from state houses to the White House. Prior to joining Inside Elections, Jacob worked at NBC News in Washington and for CNN's political unit. And with us today is Josh Kraushaar. Josh is editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider. He's senior political correspondent at Axios, and he was formerly managing editor of political coverage at the National Journal. Jacob, just before we move on to the Democrats, just give our viewers a sense, when will we know for sure who will be the Republican candidate for president in terms of the calendar of 2024?
Well, I think that we will know pretty likely who it will be by the end of, or perhaps even the middle of February, but certainly after March 5th, which is Super Tuesday, the day on the primary calendar where a large number of states, the first group of states after the so-called early states of South Carolina, New Hampshire, Iowa, and Nevada have their primaries, go to the polls. That will be, I believe, the moment where we really figure out who the nominee is going to be. But in all likelihood, if Trump, as the polls suggest, sweeps Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, it's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which he's not the Republican nominee by mid-February.
So even if he racks up all these candidates and then gets convicted of something and gets ordered to go to jail, he could still be the Republican nominee?
Technically, yes. I think that the Republican Party at various points will have to make a set of decisions. During the primaries, it will fall to the voters to decide whether they want to vote for a man who has been convicted in this hypothetical of felonies. And then at the convention, it will fall to the delegates to decide whether they want to vote for Trump after he's won the primaries, even if he's convicted. And then following the convention, it will fall to the members of the Republican National Committee, which will have to deal with any kind of post-convention developments in his legal cases. They will have the power to remove him from the ballot if they so choose. That would be an incredibly bold and audacious move on their part that I don't think that they would even venture to consider, given that Trump is so strongly supported by the rank and file Republican Party. He is who they want, and ultimately the party is probably going to be responsive to the voters more so than the judicial system.
All right, let's move to the incumbent, Joe Biden. Josh, sitting president, the leader of his party, is he facing any primary challengers?
Well, he is technically facing a primary challenge from current Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips, who has the advantage of having amassed quite a bit of personal wealth. So he's campaigning in New Hampshire. He spent most of his time up in New Hampshire, which, interestingly enough, as Jacob was saying before, it's sort of gotten demoted from the sort of gotten decommissioned, if you will, from the regular primary calendar. So they're holding a first in the nation primary the same day as the Republican primary in New Hampshire, but the DNC is not awarding delegates from New Hampshire. So it's sort of a beauty contest. And the president is actually going to be competing on a write-in basis. He's not on the ballot, but he's going to be competing in New Hampshire on a write-in basis against Dean Phillips, also against Marianne Williamson, who ran in the last election, sort of a self-help author who was, not a very serious candidate. So yes, there will be challengers on the ballot, none of them too serious. The big challenge is going to be, I think, Biden's health, and the question, he's 81 years old, he's going to be 86 at the end of a potential second term. So the question is, how do voters deal with that, and whether he has any health questions during the 2024 campaign. And he also is facing a lot of unrest within his own party among young voters. The progressive left is not viewing his presidency favorably. So if there's any unrest within the grassroots, you might see a surprise, maybe in New Hampshire, maybe from someone like a Phillips. But look, the challenge isn't going to be for Biden in the primary. It's going to be facing very mediocre at best approval ratings in the general election against Donald Trump.
Just to make sure that our viewers understand the mechanics here, though, so Joe Biden's name will not actually be on the ballot in the state of New Hampshire. Voters will have to write in Joseph Biden below the printed names of Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's a very unusual dynamic because New Hampshire, as Jacob outlined, has had that very, very vaunted first in the nation status for both the Democrats and the Republicans for about the last 50 years. But the Democratic Party, the Democratic National Committee, decided they wanted to shake up the calendar. They wanted to promote states like South Carolina and Michigan that are more racially diverse, and punish states like Iowa and New Hampshire for not being as representative of the country racially and ethnically. So as part of that process, New Hampshire decided to keep its primary. They did not go along with the DNC plan, and as a result, they were penalized. But they're still holding their primary without Joe Biden's name on the ballot. So if people want to support the president in New Hampshire, they're going to have to write in that name and hope for the best, I guess. In New Hampshire.
Just on New Hampshire, Josh, what would constitute, a serious blow to Joe Biden? Is it 10% for Dean Phillips, 20% for Dean Phillips? What would constitute a blow?
Well, look, I think a lot of comparisons have been made to 1968, the New Hampshire primary, where Gene McCarthy tallied I think over 40% of the primary vote in that election, which forced LBJ to announce he wasn't going to be running for re-election. So I think it has to be closer to kind of a third of the vote. I mean, Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson combined, if they got more than a third of the vote, I think that would be a blow to the Biden campaign. David,
what do you think? What would constitute a moral and political blow to Joe Biden in New Hampshire?
I guess I mean, obviously, if the other two candidates combined were to get, almost half the vote, and if Biden were to win with a plurality instead of an outright majority, that would be pretty significant, very, very significant.
Jacob, when you think about the Democratic calendar, what is the latest date that Joe Biden could look in the mirror and say, my poll numbers are consistently low. Maybe I am ready for retirement and it's time for somebody else.
Look, I think Joe Biden is the president. He can do whatever he wants. Truthfully, I think that he can all the way up to the convention. I think the actual process would be pretty straightforward in some ways. Look, this is why we have a vice president. Frankly, I think there's a lot of conversation about the Democratic primary process that ignores the fact that there is a number two in the Biden administration, and Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president, is set up to take Biden's place if Biden is no longer able to do the job. And so while, yes, it is theoretically possible that at any point other candidates could jump in, we're already past filing deadlines. Candidates will struggle to raise money, to gain support. Even the other big names in the Democratic Party, people like Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker, Gretchen Whitmer, are not super well known across the country, even if they are in political circles. I don't think that Biden is going to step aside. I think barring a health issue or some unforeseen circumstance like that, I think he is going to continue running for president. He's going to win the Democratic nomination. He's going to be on the ticket in next November.
Josh, David, Jacob, we have only about a minute left, and so we're going to throw caution to the wind, since I don't know where we're all going to be a year from now, and I don't know if this show's even going to exist a year from now. So a year from now, who's going to be jumping for joy having just been elected president of the United States? Josh?
Well, look, I will say that the polling, if you just took Biden and Trump's name off the polls, you would look at Trump as the narrow favorite in this race. Biden has the worst numbers for any incumbent. That's certainly dating back to George H.W. Bush. They're comparable, maybe even worse than Jimmy Carter's in 1979 at the same time. So, if you just took Biden and Trump out of the picture, just showed me the data, you would say Trump is actually the favorite. Now, I think there are a lot of, as we've discussed, a lot of wild cards to come legally. So that makes this race, I think, more of a toss-up. But boy, Biden is in very rough shape for a Democratic.
So are you hiding behind toss-up here?
I would say narrow Trump advantage right now.
Narrow Trump.
51%.
All right, David Hawkins, who just got elected president?
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump from David Hawkins. And Josh and Jacob Rabashkin.
I'm going to go with Josh here. I think it's going to be really close. We know what this looks like. These two guys ran against each other in a really close competitive race in 2020. I think the American politics moves very quickly, but also very slowly. I think it's going to look a lot like 2020. Same states are going to be very competitive. The result is going to be very close. Who will be the ultimate victor? Too difficult to say right now. I know that's not a fun answer, but it's the right one.
Too difficult to say. Toss up and a close but clear Donald Trump from David Hawkins. All right, gentlemen, thank you all so much for helping to explain American politics to our viewers abroad. Thank you for joining me on Dakhel Washington. إلى هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات عن هذه الحلقة، وخاصة الصلة بين الانتخابات التمهيدية والانتخابات الرسمية في نوفمبر، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي على تويتر @InsideWashington أو مراسلتي على @RobSatloff. وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع القادم، شكرا وإلى اللقاء.